2 days before my daughter's wedding, I received 2 text messages from an unknown number. The first told me not to attend the wedding. The second warned me not to return home that night. I called back immediately, but the line was completely silent. No one picked up. No explanation, leaving behind a very clear feeling that someone was arranging something I was not meant to know. And in my mind, there was only one question left: was someone planning to harm me? I did not panic. I did not run. I chose to move step by step to stay quiet and observe to follow even the smallest signs until I touched a truth, more painful than I had ever imagined. If you are listening to this story, leave a single dot so I know you are still there. Tell me which city you are listening from. And if you want to give me more motivation to continue telling my story, please subscribe to the channel and walk with me. I am truly grateful that you are here and listening up to this moment. My name is Graham Whitlock, 69 years old. At this age, people usually call me the boss, the founder, or more simply the old man about to retire. But if you ask who I believe I am, my answer is short: a man who spent his entire life making sure goods moved on the right path and promises were delivered on time. 40 years ago, I started with an empty lot beside an old railway line on the west side of the city. No office, no sign, no permanent staff. I bought a few used shipping containers, put up a temporary fence, and took on individual shipments. During the day, I signed contracts. At night, I drove the trucks myself. On cold, rainy nights, I spread my coat across the container floor and slept beside stacks of wooden pallets just to be ready for the first train delivery at dawn. That was how I learned the trade. No theory, no shortcuts. One mistake cost you a client. One late shipment cost you your reputation. Gradually, people started calling me when they needed something delivered urgently. Road contracts began connecting with rail lines. Transfer depots appeared. Warehouses expanded year by year. Whitlock Intermodal and Storage Group was built from nights spent sleeping in freezing containers and mornings counting every dollar to make sure wages were paid on time. My wife, Marion, was the only person who never asked when I would stop. She understood I was not building the company just for money. I worked to keep a promise to my family that my daughter would never have to lower her head for lack of support. Marion passed away nearly 10 years ago. After the funeral, the house did not feel empty in the sense of missing voices, but silent in a way that anyone who stepped inside could feel her absence. From that day on, Isla became my only remaining emotional anchor. She grew up with the smell of engine oil, the sound of container trucks coming and going, and midnight phone calls reporting delayed shipments. I never taught her how to get rich. I taught her only one thing: never take what is not yours, even if you have the chance. Isla's wedding was scheduled for the weekend, Saturday. At that moment, it was still Thursday afternoon. I thought I just needed to finish a few things at the depot and head home early. I prepared everything quietly. No lavish gatherings, no showing off. To me, it was an important milestone, not because of the celebration, but because from that point on, my daughter would step into a different life. A father must know when to step back, but stepping back by choice is completely different from being pushed aside. The wedding gift I chose was not something flashy. I do not believe in using money to impress. I stopped by a familiar jewelry store, the same place where I had bought gifts for Marion many years ago. The clerk brought out several options talking about purity, carat weight, and cuts. I listened, but I did not rush. In the end, I chose a diamond bracelet with a simple design, nothing ornate. The small stones were evenly set, reflecting just enough light without being blinding. The listed price was $38,000, not a number meant for bragging, but enough to say the gift was chosen with care, not bought just to get it over with. I held the bracelet in my hand and felt its weight. Not heavy, but solid. Like what I always wanted Isla to have in life, not flashy, but durable. I signed the receipt, placed the box into my bag, and felt lighter than I expected. Not because the task was done, but because I knew I had chosen correctly. That afternoon, I drove to the West Depot. Work was proceeding as usual. Trucks moved in and out constantly. Dock workers handled cargo with steady rhythm. The radio crackled with short exchanges. I walked along the lane between containers, greeting a few familiar faces. The way they looked at me was not flattery, but trust built over many years. Here I was not an old man. I was the one who kept the rhythm. I stopped in front of a newly completed warehouse, checked the unit number, asked briefly about progress. Everything was fine, no delays, no signs of anything unusual. The company was running smoothly, just as it had for many years. On my way back to the car, I found myself thinking of Marion. If she were still alive, she would have reminded me to go home early, eat a proper meal, and prepare myself for our child's big day. I stood by the car door for a few seconds and took a deep breath. The fatigue did not come from the work, but from the awareness that I had nearly completed a long journey. A very honest thought surfaced in my mind, unembellished. Perhaps this was the last time I would still be strong enough to protect my daughter, not because I was about to fall, but because at some point everyone has to yield their place. I had just closed the car door when my phone vibrated lightly in my jacket pocket. Not a call, just a short buzz. I paused for a beat before taking it out. The screen lit up, an unknown number, no name, no note. The message contained only 2 lines. Don't come to the wedding if you want to keep the company in your decision-making power. I read it again more slowly. The wording was too direct, the kind used by someone who knows exactly who they are threatening. The kind of message without a greeting or explanation, as if someone had dialed the wrong number or deliberately wanted attention. I gave a faint smirk. In business, I had received plenty of messages like this before competitors, making threats disgruntled former employees, or simply thoughtless pranks. Not everything that appears on a phone screen is worth stopping for. My heartbeat remained steady. My breathing did not falter. There was only a brief sensation along my spine, coming and going quickly, like the reflex of someone whose caution has been sharpened beyond necessity. I locked the screen and placed the phone on the passenger seat, but I had already taken a screenshot out of habit. In my line of work. Anything unusual deserves a record. Outside, the depot continued to operate steadily. Trucks moved in and out. Everything ran on schedule. There was nothing to suggest that an anonymous text message could derail that entire system. I drove home as usual. I set that message aside, at least in my mind. I told myself it was probably a wrong number or some harmless scare tactic. With 40 years spent in the business world, I'd seen every kind of cheap pressure play. Not everything that appears on a screen is worth stopping for. When I reached the gate, I opened the car door, stepped out, locked it out of habit. Everything was still quiet. The house lights were already off. Not all the neighbors were home yet. There were no unusual signs to warrant further concern. I went inside, hung up my coat, set my keys on the shelf. Dinner went smoothly, following the routine I'd kept for years. After eating, I opened my laptop to quickly check a few reports. The numbers were solid. Contracts were moving along on schedule. There were no notable disruptions at the company. That only reinforced my initial thought. If someone was trying to stir trouble, they'd chosen the wrong time and the wrong approach. I shut the computer down and stood up to pour a glass of water. When I returned to the table, my phone vibrated again. This time the sound was shorter, more deliberate, as if the sender was sure I'd notice. The screen lit up. The same unknown number. Don't go home tonight. I stood still for a few seconds. If the first message could be brushed off as a mistake or a prank, this one couldn't. I picked up the phone and called. It rang steadily, then cut off. No one answered. I tried again, letting it ring longer this time. Same result. Whoever was on the other end clearly didn't want to talk. They only wanted to deliver a message, no dialogue required. My rational mind went straight into analysis mode. No name, no specific demand. In business, that's a threat with no real weight. Overreacting would only put me in a position where I was being led. The businessman in me wanted to shut this down right here. But my survival instinct disagreed. I'd avoided plenty of disasters simply by listening to that faint sense of unease, that appears before everything collapses. The sender knew my schedule. They knew about the wedding, they knew the company, and now they knew I was home. I walked slowly around the living room, looking out the window. The street in front of the house was empty. The streetlights glowed evenly. No unfamiliar figures, no cars idling too long. On the surface, everything was fine, but that very calm was what unsettled me. I stopped at the table and looked at the phone again. If I ignored it and something happened, I'd never forgive myself. If I followed the warning and nothing happened, I'd only lose one night sleeping somewhere else. Compared to everything I'd built, that wasn't a high price to pay. The decision formed faster than I expected. I grabbed my coat, took my wallet, checked my keys. Before leaving, I turned off a few lights and locked the door more carefully than usual. Not out of panic, but out of the habit of someone who always wants to maintain control. In the car, I opened a booking app. A hotel in the city center came up. Good security. Plenty of cameras. A front desk staffed all night. Not too luxurious, not attention-grabbing. I confirmed the reservation, turned off the phone, and drove away from the familiar neighborhood. I didn't call Isla. It wasn't time to pull her into something I didn't yet understand. I also didn't inform my staff or security. If this was a real warning, spreading the word now would only complicate things, and I wasn't sure who in my system still truly belonged to me until I knew who this person was. The hotel welcomed me with soft lighting and the scent of freshly cleaned floors. I checked in, took the elevator up, and locked the door behind me. The space was quiet, private enough to think. I set my phone on the table, sat down in the chair, and let my shoulders relax. The message was still there. I didn't delete it. I needed to remember this feeling, the feeling when something that seems harmless starts demanding serious attention. Outside, the city kept operating as usual, but I understood clearly that from this moment on, I could no longer pretend everything was still under control. That night, I didn't fall asleep right away. I lay there staring at the ceiling, letting my thoughts slow down. My daughter's wedding was only one day away. The company was still running smoothly. But somewhere out there, someone had just forced me to change my plans. And I knew that in the morning I would begin finding out who thought they had the right to tell me how I should live my life. I still hadn't fallen asleep when the phone vibrated. The clock on the bedside table had just passed midnight. The glow from the screen washing the hotel ceiling, enough for me to clearly see a name that hadn't appeared in a long time, Caleb Morneau. I didn't answer right away, not out of hesitation, but because I was lining up the possible scenarios in my head. Caleb was someone I had once trusted, once delegated authority to, and then personally removed from the company quietly, without noise or lawsuits. A clean decision after I discovered he had kept several side contracts off the books. I let him go without driving him into a corner, and in the years that followed, we had no contact. The phone vibrated again, and I answered. Graham Caleb said, his voice low and direct. I know calling at this hour isn't right, but you need to hear this. I'm listening, I replied evenly. Are you at home right now? That question made me sit up. I looked around the silent room and answered shortly, no. Caleb exhaled audible on the other end. That's good. You called just to say that? No, he said. I'm calling because I heard something you shouldn't have had to hear by accident. I didn't interrupt him. With Caleb, once he started, he would say everything, and my silence was the fastest way to draw the truth out. This afternoon, I was at Elliot Vance's office. Caleb continued. I went to see his lawyer about a personal matter. While I was waiting outside the conference room, the door wasn't fully closed. They just asked an assistant to bring in more files. The door was ajar, and the hallway was empty. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but your name came through very clearly. I heard your name. I closed my eyes for a second. Elliot Vance, the family attorney, the man who had worked with me for years, the one I had allowed into the most private corners of my assets and plans. There were 3 people in the room, Caleb said. Elliot, Isla, and Rowan. I didn't react. I needed to hear all of it. They weren't talking about wedding finances, Caleb went on. They were talking about guardianship, about a capacity hearing, about transferring control of the company if you are no longer competent. I opened my eyes. My heart didn't race, but my chest tightened unmistakably. Because those terms don't surface in casual conversation, they are legal. Bricks laid in the correct order. They were very specific, Caleb said. Timelines, medical records, witnesses. Elliot asked how to prove that you are no longer capable of making your own decisions. I smiled faintly without making a sound. And what was the answer? Caleb hesitated for half a beat, then said the sentence that made the room seem to shrink. In that conversation, no one questioned whether you had lost capacity. They spoke to each other as if that part was already settled, and the only thing they were still weighing was which day to choose to turn you into someone without decision-making. Power. I let that sentence land between us without interrupting or pushing back, just listening, as in my head. Each piece began finding its place, the messages, the warnings not to come home. Rowan's recent confidence. Isla's roundabout questions about documents, signing authority representatives. Are you sure? I asked, calmly. I'm sure, Caleb replied. I stood there long enough to hear them talk about sending you for a capacity evaluation. Not immediately, but after the wedding. They need you to appear. They need the image of a complete family, and only then will they move to the next step. Why are you calling me? On the other end, Caleb was silent for a few seconds. Because I once owed you a debt, and because this time, if I don't speak, this will go further than I think. I leaned back in the chair. Everything was far clearer now, no longer vague messages or gut feelings, but a prepared plan with a lawyer, a script, and a timetable. Did you hear anything else? Yes, Caleb said. They talked about changing the company's structure, taking signing authority out of your hands. Elliot assured them that if the file is thick enough, the court will move very quickly. Thank you. I'll handle the rest myself. Be careful, Caleb added. From now on, don't pretend you don't know anything. The call ended and the room returned to silence. I sat there for a long time, staring into the empty space in front of me, the feeling inside me neither pain nor anger, but the absolute clarity of someone who has just realized he is standing in the middle of a chess game, where the other side has already made several moves. I didn't immediately believe what Caleb said, not because I suspected he was making it up, but because I'd learned never to draw conclusions from a single source. 40 years in business had taught me that emotions can mislead, while data does not, and if there truly was a plan being built behind my back, it would leave traces, and my job was to find them. I sat down at the table and opened the old leather notebook I always used for work. Notes, not a laptop, not a phone. I needed something that left no digital footprint, wasn't synced, and couldn't accidentally disappear. I wrote the date at the top of the page and began listing every small incident from the past few months. At first, everything looked perfectly normal. Isla asked whether I remembered my health checkup schedule, reminded me to take my medication on time, even though I'd never forgotten words that sounded like a daughter's concern for her aging father, something I'd once found comforting, but now reread in my mind with a different voice. I remembered an evening about 3 months ago when Isla sat across from me at the dinner table, picking at her food and saying lightly, "You've been repeating old stories a lot lately." No reproach in her tone. Rowan said nothing, then just glanced at me and lowered his head to keep eating. I'd laughed it off, joked that everyone does that when they get old, and the conversation ended there, or so I thought. I turned the page and added more. Rowan asking me about warehouse rental prices in the Northern District. Not in general terms, but very specifically how long the contracts ran. What the renewal clauses were, who had signing authority, if ownership changed. I remembered answering briefly, assuming that since he was about to join the family, an interest in his future father-in-law's business was only natural. Then there was another time when Rowan mentioned that a lot of logistics companies are restructuring to optimize value, said casually, over weekend coffee as if sharing a market trend. I neither argued nor pressed him because at the time I saw no reason to be wary. I leaned back in my chair and let the fragments of memory drift in. Each one on its own was harmless, but placed side by side, they began forming a shape clearer than I wanted to admit. Isla, mentioning memory. Rowan, focusing on signing authority. Elliot Vance, appearing more frequently in conversations, always under the banner of advising for the future. I went back to the first page and drew a vertical line down the paper, labeling one side before and the other recent, and the difference was stark before Isla asked about my life. Recently, she asked about my capacity to decide for myself. Before, Rowan avoided deep talk about assets. Recently, he asked straight at the critical points. I no longer felt confused. What surfaced instead was the cold clarity of someone who has just finished assembling a map, not a map of warehouses or shipping routes, but a map of a plan prepared methodically. I closed the notebook and locked it in a drawer. There was no emotional explosion, no rage, no melodramatic pain, only the clearest understanding that I stood before a choice. React, immediately confront them, make a scene and step right into the role they wanted to assign me, or pull back, observe and let them believe everything was unfolding according to their script. I chose the latter. If they had prepared a story about me growing weaker, I would give them what they expected. Not too obvious, not too fast, just enough to build their confidence. I would pause a beat longer before answering. Let Isla repeat the schedule. Let Rowan explain a few small things for me, neither object nor confirm, leaving them to fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. Before going to bed, I glanced at the phone on the table. 2 messages were still there, and I didn't delete them. They were the starting point of everything. I turned off the light, lay down, and closed my eyes. In my mind, I was no longer a father preparing to marry off his daughter, but someone stepping into a different phase of life. From that moment on, I was no longer just Graham Whitlock, the man who kept the warehouses running. I became someone preparing for confrontation. The other side didn't yet know I had seen coming from very early on, and the next morning I decided to come back early, not to confront anyone, but to see how they would react when I appeared outside their expectations. I came home the following afternoon earlier than usual. No notice, no phone call. The familiar gate opened, the wheels rolling over the stone path, worn smooth by years of use. The house looked the same, as always, neat and quiet, exactly the way Isla liked to keep everything under control. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed a very small difference. Isla did not rush out to greet me like she usually did. Rowan stood near the kitchen holding a glass of water, his eyes lingering on me longer than necessary. No one spoke during the first few seconds. They were observing. I hung my coat on the hook, then paused, pretending to look around. "Where did I put the keys again?" I said slowly, my voice missing a beat. In truth, the keys were right there in my pocket. I could feel Isla's gaze tracking my hand as I rummaged through the drawer near the door. "You left them on the table," Isla said, pointing toward the small table by the window. I walked over, picked up the keys, and looked at them as if seeing them for the first time. "Ah, right," I said with a faint smile. Rowan said nothing, but I saw him tilt his head slightly, as if noting a detail that fit something in his mind. We sat down in the living room. Isla asked if I was tired, if I needed to rest. The question sounded proper, too proper. I answered briefly, sometimes drifting off topic. Not enough to raise suspicion, just enough for anyone who wanted to believe to keep believing. The phone buzzed, a message from a logistics partner asking about next week's delivery schedule. I opened it, stared at the screen longer than normal, then read the sender's name wrong. "Who is this again?" I asked, handing the phone to Isla. Isla took it and glanced quickly. "That's Mr. Martin, the partner on the eastern route," she said, her voice light but tense. "Ah, right," I replied with an awkward smile. "Getting old. My head's not as sharp as it used to be. All these business names start piling on top of each other." Rowan set his glass down and walked toward the window. I saw his back to me, but his shoulders were slightly tense. They didn't ask anything else. They didn't need to. For people looking for proof, silence is sometimes more valuable than words. Dinner passed in an orderliness that felt suffocating. Ayla served food onto my plate, reminded me to eat slowly. Rowan told a few stories about work, but always stopped halfway, as if checking whether I was following along. I nodded, smiled, sometimes asked a question that had already been explained. Each time their eyes met for a split second. After dinner, I stood up and said I wanted to turn in early. A bit tired, I said, placing my hand on the back of the chair to steady myself. The movement was subtle, but enough for Isla to rise instantly out of reflex. "Let me help you," she said. "No need," I replied, but I still let her take my arm. Rowan walked behind us, close enough to intervene if necessary. I realized I was being escorted inside my own house. In the bedroom, I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. My heart was steady. My mind was perfectly clear. The little performance hadn't made me uncomfortable. It had made me more certain. They were looking at me with the eyes of people who already had a conclusion, just waiting for me to prove it for them. I stood up and opened the bottom drawer of the wardrobe. Inside were 2 small recording devices, the kind I had bought years ago to check internal security. No network connection, just record store, then shut off. My bedroom was right next to the living room, a layout from when Marion was still alive. Between the 2 spaces was only a thin wall and an old wooden door. I knew exactly how sound traveled in this house, how even the quietest voices carried through on calm nights. I attached the recorder to the back of the bookshelf, opposite the bed, out of sight, but close enough to the door to capture conversations they wouldn't have when I was still sitting there. Isla and Rowan also had a habit of talking near the dining table right along that wall. I just needed to angle it right close enough, and I would get their voices. I checked the battery press test, heard a very soft click. It worked. I placed another device in the study near the desk, where Isla usually sat with her laptop. Not to eavesdrop without reason, but to preserve what they wouldn't say when I was alert. Before leaving the room, I looked at myself in the mirror. A gray-haired man, shoulders, slightly slumped eyes that looked tired. That image wasn't entirely fake. Age was real, but the confusion wasn't. I knew what I was doing, and I knew exactly why I had to do it. I went back to the living room and sat down. Isla asked if I needed anything else. I shook my head, then asked a simple question. "What are we doing tomorrow again?" Isla answered immediately, as if already prepared. I nodded as though the information had just slipped out of my memory. Rowan checked his watch and said he needed to leave early. Before going, he placed a hand on my shoulder and gave it a light pat. "Get some good rest, Dad," he said. His voice sounded sincere enough that if I hadn't known better, I might have believed it. When the door closed, the house fell silent. I sat there a while longer, then stood and went back to my room. The recording devices were still running silent, like an invisible third presence. That night, I lay on the bed, one hand resting on my chest, feeling my steady breathing. I didn't feel ashamed of playing weak in my own home. This wasn't self-degradation. This was strategy. If they needed an old man to complete their plan, I would give them exactly that image. And the truth, I would keep piece by piece, until there was enough that they could no longer deny it. That morning, I sat at the dining table like every other day, drinking water, reading the paper unhurried. Isla came out of the kitchen and set a glass down in front of me. She lingered longer than usual, her eyes sweeping across the table before stopping on my phone. I said nothing. Isla picked it up and moved quickly. One swipe of her finger, then she placed the phone back in its exact spot. "You get way too many spam messages, Dad," she said softly. "I deleted some so they wouldn't bother you." I nodded. Yeah. I only nodded because the screenshot had already been saved in my notes since last night. I didn't check the phone again. I knew exactly what she had just deleted. What caught my attention wasn't the missing message, but the fact that she decided for me, then spoke as if she were helping. Near noon, Rowan arrived. He was neatly dressed, a file folder in his hand. After greetings, he sat across from me, his gaze steady, but constantly flicking around the room, like someone memorizing a layout. "Have you been forgetting things lately?" Dad Rowan asked. "Just small things," I replied. "Like names appointments," he continued, his tone still polite. "At my age, that happens to everyone." Rowan nodded and opened the folder. We think you should see a doctor once, just to be safe. Isla stood beside him and immediately added, It's just a conversation, Dad. Nothing serious. I asked only one question. When next week, Rowan answered. I already made the appointment. I looked at him. I didn't ask which doctor. I didn't ask where. I understood. The decision had been made before I ever heard about it. Isla handed me a sheet of paper. Can you sign this for me, Dad? It just allows the doctor to share information with us. I skimmed it. The wording was very careful. There wasn't a single word that sounded like coercion, but the meaning was clear. From now on, others would have the right to discuss my condition instead of me. I signed. Rowan let out a small breath. Isla slipped the paper into her bag, visibly more relaxed. We're just worried about you, Isla said. I understand, I replied. They chatted a bit more about the wedding, about schedules. I listened, asked a few small questions, acting a little slower than usual. Rowan and Isla exchanged a brief look, very subtle. That afternoon, both of them left. The house returned to silence. I passed through the living room and looked toward the bookshelf near the bedroom door. The recording device I had attached to the back of the shelf was still there, close enough to capture every conversation. I didn't touch it. I only needed to be sure it was still working. That night, I ate alone. The phone lay on the table. The strange message was gone. I didn't try to recover it. There was no need anymore. I understood perfectly well what was happening. Everything was spoken in the language of concern and neatly scheduled appointments in proper paperwork. But every small step led in one direction. I was being pushed out of the right to decide for myself. And I remained silent, because to let them believe they were winning, I needed them to think I hadn't realized anything at all. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. No rush, no tension. I ate a tidy breakfast, put on my coat, and left the house on time like any other day. To anyone watching, I was just an old man keeping to his routine. What they didn't see was that I had changed my route. My first destination wasn't the company office or the warehouse. I drove to a low-rise building in the old financial district, a place without a large sign. The office of Helen Strauss, an attorney who specializes in family asset disputes and private businesses. No referrals. I sought her out for one simple reason: she had never worked for my family. Helen listened without interrupting. I didn't dwell on emotions. I laid out everything that had happened in chronological order. The messages, the erasing of traces, the cognitive evaluation schedule, the information release forms. She took steady notes, occasionally asking a short question that cut straight to the point. You want to retain control, Helen said after I finished, and you want to prepare before they make their next move. Yes. Then you need two things, she replied. Secure your legal authority immediately, and gather enough information so they can't pivot once exposed. I nodded. No further explanation was needed. Helen began with basic but decisive documents. A conditional medical power of attorney, activated only with two independent opinions. A notarized statement affirming my current capacity, and a temporary adjustment to my will, undisclosed, but enforceable if a dispute arose. We move fast, Helen said, and we keep it quiet. Leaving the law office, I drove to the other side of the city. A small financial investigation firm, few people operating under confidential contracts. I didn't ask them to follow anyone. I only requested a review of financial data tied to the names I provided: Rowan, Isla, and several shell companies I suspected I'd seen pass through earlier conversations. They didn't ask much. They just needed time. While waiting for results, I returned to the company as usual. I walked through the warehouses, asked a few questions about progress, signed a few familiar documents. I noticed Rowan making more calls, leaving his office more often. Isla stopped by my office, once asked if I remembered next week's meeting. I answered slowly, mixed up the date, then corrected myself. Their eyes met briefly, then both of them looked reassured. 3 days later, my phone vibrated. Not an unknown number. The investigation firm. I had already given them leads. I'd long suspected names of companies, timing of transfers, so cross-checking moved faster than normal. We met in a small, windowless conference room. The lead investigator slid a thin file toward me. I opened it. Rowan came first. Gambling debt. Not once. Multiple small amounts scattered, but together large enough to create pressure. Short-term loans, high interest. Several transfers outside company systems, but tied to periods when I signed major contracts. Isla followed. No debt, but names on paper. Auxiliary warehouse leases, intermediary accounts. Several documents signed in a personal capacity without board approval. Not illegal when viewed individually. But together they formed a network capable of transferring control when the opportunity arose. I read everything, missing no detail. There was no surge of betrayal. Instead, there was clarity. Every past question now had an answer. That evening, I returned to see Helen. She reviewed the file, marking a few spots with red ink. "This is enough," she said. "Enough for you to take the initiative." We updated the temporary will. No one was removed yet. Only the order and conditions changed. Some assets were placed into a short-term trust. Signature authority remained on paper, but activation of any transfer was locked behind conditions only Helen and I knew. "You don't need to announce anything," she said. "Let them believe everything is the same." That's exactly what I did. Back home, I opened my notebook and wrote a few short lines. A list of relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, people who had put in small capital in the early days, those who worked warehouses with me before the company even had a name. I sent out wedding invitations, not lavish, but broad enough that the room wouldn't be filled with only immediate family. Isla asked why I was inviting so many people. I answered simply, "It's been a long time since I've seen them." Rowan didn't object. The boy even seemed pleased. The more people, the more he believed everything was already in his hands. That night I turned on the recorder again. Battery full. The file played immediately. Isla's voice came first, calm, and even Dad's easy to lead. Just pretend to worry about his health, and he starts thinking he's useless. Rowan chuckled softly. He's used to letting others decide. We're just speeding things up. Isla continued without lowering her voice. "After the wedding, it's done. With a crowd there, anything he says just sounds like old age confusion," Rowan replied cold. "The doctor said he doesn't need to cooperate. The file's thick enough for the court to sign off." Isla finished with a line that made me stand still. "Dad's only good at hauling boxes. This stuff is for us to handle." The file ended. I took off the headphones and set the device down. My chest was heavy, my mind clear. I didn't get angry. I memorized every sentence, not to argue, but to repeat them into a microphone, word for word. I sat back in my chair and looked around the familiar house. Everything was still in its place. Only my role had changed. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. They thought I was slowing down. They thought I was letting things drift. What they didn't expect was that I had already started rebuilding the board on my own terms. 3 days before the wedding, I proactively called the event production company. My voice was slow and deliberate, like a father who wanted everything to be proper for his daughter. I requested an upgraded sound system compared to the original package. Wireless microphones, a central mixer, and a dedicated connection line for personal devices. The coordinator asked for the reason. I answered naturally. "My speech is a bit long. I don't want guests sitting far away to strain their ears." No one was suspicious. In my position, the request sounded reasonable. That afternoon, the technical team came to survey the venue. I stayed the entire time asking a few basic questions about recording range sensitivity and receiver placement. I acted slightly slow to understand, letting them explain things several times. Meanwhile, I memorized every detail, where the connection ports were, which lines could be patched into, the distance from the stage to the family table. When they left, everything was more ready than they realized. Isla called me that evening. She asked about the sound system, her voice unable to hide the tension. "Why do you need so much equipment, Dad?" "You're inviting a lot of people," I replied. "If I speak briefly, it'd be a waste." Isla went quiet for a beat. "Dad, just a few sentences is enough." "Yeah, I said. I know. My answer didn't reassure her. I could clearly hear the worry in her voice, not because the speech might be long or short, but because she understood that once the microphone was on, nothing would be under anyone's sole control anymore. The next day, Rowan came to find me at the office. He stepped in and closed the door more carefully than necessary. Do you want me to review the program again? Rowan asked. I'm worried it might drag on and tire the guests. I looked at him and smiled lightly. I'll only speak for a few minutes. You're overthinking it. Rowan nodded, but his eyes showed clear wariness. He asked a few more questions about the speaking order, the cake-cutting time when the music would start. The questions sounded supportive, but they were really checks. I answered slowly sometimes, mixing up the order and then correcting myself so he would believe I was still an old man, easily guided. That evening, Isla came over. She walked around the living room, looking at the equipment, at the neatly arranged cables running along the wall. I pretended not to notice. Are you tired? Dad Isla asked. Not really, I replied. Just a bit of a headache. Isla looked at me a moment longer, then turned away. She pulled out her phone and texted someone. I didn't need to guess who it was, Rowan. On rehearsal day, I arrived on time. I stood by the stage and tested the microphone. The sound was clear, no echo. I nodded to the technician and said a few words of thanks. They thought I was just a meticulous father. Isla stood below, gripping her dress tightly. Rowan kept checking his watch. Both of them wanted everything to pass quickly, neatly, exactly according to the script they had drawn up. I stepped down and walked past the family table. Isla lightly caught my hand. Dad, please don't say anything outside the plan. I placed my hand over hers and said calmly, I'm only going to tell the truth. That made Isla let go immediately. She understood the truth was the one thing they couldn't control. The night before the wedding, I was alone in my study. I checked my personal device again and tested its connection to the sound system. The signal was stable. The line was clean. No one else knew I had the ability to activate it besides the technician and me. I didn't replay any recordings. I didn't need to rehearse. What had happened was already clear enough in my mind. They thought this stage was built for a wedding. They thought the microphone would be turned on for blessings. They thought I was just an emotional father who would say a few words and step down. What they didn't understand was that once the stage is set, the person standing on it decides how the story is told. And this time I had no intention of letting anyone cut me off. The wedding day began very early. I woke up on time and put on the suit that had been hanging there since the night before. Isla chose a light gray color for me, saying it looked gentle and appropriate for my age. I didn't object. The tie was knotted slightly crooked, and I left it that way. A small detail, just enough for the people waiting for signs to nod to one another. The venue was more crowded than I expected. Relatives from far away, old friends, a few longtime business partners. Greetings, laughter, the clink of glasses followed one another. I stood on the edge, shaking hands with each person speaking less than usual. Some asked about my health. I answered briefly. Some brought up old stories. I smiled and shifted the topic. Everything moved at exactly the rhythm they expected. Isla stepped out in her white wedding dress. She looked radiant, her face carefully made up, her smile measured. I looked at my daughter and remembered the mornings I walked her to school, the smell of her wet hair after a bath, the tiny hand gripping mine when we crossed the street. Those memories didn't disappear because of what she had said about me behind my back. They existed alongside it, making what I felt more complicated, but they didn't make me hesitate. Rowan stood next to Isla, back straight eyes confident. The boy shook hands with guests, spoke smoothly, answered questions about work in the tone of someone who had rehearsed his role. I caught fragments, expansion plans, new directions, the future of the family. Each time I only nodded and didn't step in. I let them get used to me standing outside. When it was time for me to walk Isla down the aisle, she squeezed my hand a little tighter. Not from fear, from tension. I walked slowly, evenly keeping the pace. From the rows of seats I saw a few exchanged glances. They were watching every step, every breath. I didn't give them what they were waiting for. No staggering, no missed beat. Just a little slower than before. After the ceremony, the reception began. The music was turned up, the lighting just right. I sat at the family table listening to familiar congratulations. Isla leaned over and whispered to ask if I was tired. I said fine, then fell silent. Rowan poured water for me more carefully than necessary. I took a small sip, set the glass down, and said nothing more. In my head, everything was very clear. The words they had spoken in that house, the calm tone, the way they referred to me with words they thought I couldn't hear. I didn't let anything show on my face. I let it sit still like an object placed exactly where it belonged, waiting for the moment it would be used. Guests ate and chatted loudly. Many turned to me and asked about the company. I answered briefly, sometimes mixing up the name of a project and then correcting myself. Rowan quickly stepped in, explaining for me. Isla looked at me and gave a small nod, as if everything was going according to plan. I saw them relax, little by little. Rowan smiled more. Isla leaned back in her chair, shoulders loosening. They thought the hardest part was over. They thought I was used to letting others speak for me, decide for me. They thought today was just a happy day now, with no surprises left. In the middle of the reception, the coordinator came over and asked about the speech. I replied slowly, in a bit. Isla heard and turned to look at me. A flicker of worry crossed her eyes, then was quickly hidden. Rowan glanced at his watch and quietly asked about the program order. I gave the wrong time, then chuckled it off. They looked at each other, their expressions softening. The music faded. The coordinator took the microphone and introduced the speech of the bride's father. I stood up and adjusted my jacket. What I felt wasn't nervousness. It was like the focus before an important meeting, where every word has already been weighed. I stepped onto the stage. The lights shone straight at me. The murmurs died down. I took the microphone and tested a greeting. The sound was clear, steady. I looked down. Isla smiled, trying to keep her composure. Rowan sat upright, hands on the table, convinced he was in a safe position. They didn't know that from this moment on, everything they believed they had in their grasp was about to slip away. I paused for a beat, letting the whole room fall completely silent. In that silence, I saw clearly what they thought of me, a man who had grown weak, slow, ready to let others decide for him. I let them hold on to that thought for a few more seconds. Then I began to speak. I stood at the microphone and looked around the room. Familiar faces mixed with unfamiliar ones. Relatives, friends, former partners. Many had once eaten meals with me at the old warehouse yard. Many others only knew me through contracts. All of them were waiting for a safe speech, a few blessings, then polite applause. "I'm Graham," I said, my voice just loud enough. "The bride's father." A few light chuckles rippled through the room. I paused, letting the silence settle completely. Family is where people place their greatest trust. And it's also where, if that trust is misused, the consequences are the worst. Isla looked up. Rowan leaned slightly forward, eyes probing. I could see the caution appear just in time. I worked for 40 years, keeping goods on the right routes, keeping promises on time. I always believed that if I did things right, the people beside me would too. I looked toward the family table. Isla gave a strained smile. Rowan rested his hand on his water glass, holding it steady. "But trust," I said slowly, "doesn't mean closing your eyes." I bent down and placed my hand on a personal device that was already connected. No one in the hall noticed the movement. The coordinator beside me thought I was adjusting the microphone. The sound came on. Isla's voice played. First, there was some background noise, but the words were clear enough that no one could pretend they misheard Dad's easy to lead. "Just talk, slowly, ask a few times, and he'll start thinking he's useless on his own." The room froze. A few people turned to look at each other. Isla half stood up, then stopped short. Rowan's voice came next, cold and even. "He's used to letting others decide. We're just speeding things up a little." The clink of spoons against glasses stopped entirely. A few people in the back frowned. Rowan glanced toward the technical table, then at me. The audio continued. Isla spoke again, calm in a way that was chilling. After the wedding, it's done. With a crowd this big, even if he reacts, it'll just look like old age. A sharp inhale came from somewhere. Relatives lowered their heads. Someone raised a hand to cover their mouth. Isla was visibly shaking her hands, gripping her dress. Rowan continued without hesitation. The doctor said he doesn't need to cooperate. The file's thick enough for the court to sign off. Guardianship goes through fast. I lifted my head and looked straight out at the hall. No one laughed. No one whispered. Every eye was fixed on the family table. Isla's voice played one last time the words, razor sharp. Dad's only good at hauling goods. Let us handle this stuff. Assisted living will be convenient. The audio stopped. The silence stretched, not for a few seconds. Longer than that. Long enough for everyone to understand what they had just heard. Long enough that no one could pretend it was a misunderstanding. I raised my head and continued in my own voice. That is what I heard inside my own house. Isla stammered, Dad, you heard it wrong. Rowan stood up, his voice higher than usual. Someone edited. I raised my hand. I didn't raise my voice. Just a single gesture enough to stop every excuse. Don't, I said, looking straight at him. If it's edited, take it for analysis. I'm ready. I turned to the relatives. I didn't come up here to curse anyone. I came up here to say that when people discuss selling your company, right in front of you, when they calculate the day you'll lose the right to decide for yourself, that's no longer a family matter. Rowan sat back down, his face pale. Isla stood, frozen tears spilling over, but no one stepped forward. I wish my daughter happiness, I said, keeping my voice steady. But I also make this clear, every decision about my assets, my company, and my life, from this moment on, no one speaks for me but me. I set the microphone down. I didn't wait for applause. I didn't need anyone to confirm it. Below, murmurs erupted, rapid questions, shifting looks, heavy shakes of the head. Isla lowered her face. Rowan avoided everyone's eyes. The voice had already been heard, and once it was out, no one could ever take it back. The reception ended in an uneasy limbo. Guests left earlier than expected. There was no loud laughter. No one lingered to offer congratulations as planned. I stepped down from the stage and did not return to the family table. I walked straight into the small meeting room behind the hall, the one the organizers used for short breaks. A few minutes later, the door flew open. Isla entered first. The wedding dress was still pristine, but her face was completely different. The makeup could not hide her reddened eyes. Rowan followed, slamming the door shut. What the hell were you doing? Rowan snapped. You think you had the right to ruin our wedding. I pulled out a chair and sat down. Sit. It's time we talked. Isla shook her head, tears streaming. You don't understand. You humiliated us in front of so many people. Honor, I replied, isn't lost because someone says it out loud. It's lost when you do it, and it gets exposed. Rowan slammed his hand on the table. You're obsessed. Those recordings, I set the file down on the table, cutting him off. It wasn't thick, but it was heavy enough to make a sharp sound. Before you say anything else, I said, listen to everything. I opened the first folder, printed financial statements. I slid them toward Rowan. Gambling debt, I said flatly, not small. Spread across multiple places. Some of it lines up with when I signed a major contract. Rowan froze, his face drained of color. You were spying on me. I was checking the facts, I replied. I moved to the second folder and placed it in front of Isla. Accounts in your personal name, a secondary warehouse, an intermediary account. What capacity did you sign under Isla? Stared down her hands, visibly trembling. I just followed advice, whose Isla didn't answer. Rowan turned to look at her, his expression changing. I opened the final folder, and this is what you both thought I didn't know. I placed my phone on the table and opened the saved screenshots. 2 messages appeared in full. Don't come to the wedding if you still want to keep the company and decision-making power. Don't come home tonight. Isla jerked her head up. Dad, where did you get that? You deleted it on your phone, but you couldn't delete what I had already saved. Rowan jumped to his feet. That has nothing to do with... It does, I said. Those 2 messages were bait. One pulled me away from the wedding in a state of anxiety. One pushed me out of the house so they could control the space. After that, all they had to do was record my reaction label, it, unstable, and bring it to doctors and lawyers. That wasn't a mistake. That was a plan. The room fell silent. Isla collapsed into the chair, covering her face. Rowan paced back and forth, breathing hard. You knew everything, Isla sobbed. We were just afraid you'd change your mind. You were afraid of losing control, afraid I was still clear-headed. I took out another set of papers and placed them on the table. The will has been amended, I said. Temporarily. Effective. Immediately. Rowan turned back. What does that mean? It means from now on, I said slowly, all assets signing authority and decision-making power come with conditions. Neither of you can stand in for me. Neither of you can represent me unless independent criteria are met. Isla looked up, her voice breaking. Then, what about this wedding? I looked at her. You still get married, but you no longer stand on the foundation you thought you had. Outside the meeting room, I heard voices fading. The relatives already knew. No one came in. No one took their side. The looks on the stage earlier had said enough. Rowan sank into a chair, clutching his head. You've destroyed us. I stood. No. I just stopped, shielding you. I looked at Isla one last time. You lost the wedding you imagined. Lost your standing in front of the people you wanted to impress. Lost the position you thought was guaranteed. But you still have one thing, the truth. And from now on, you have to live with it. I opened the door and walked out. The hallway was empty. No one stopped me. No one called after me. Behind me, the masks had fallen, and this time there was no one left with enough hands to pick them up. I left the banquet hall while the whispers still hung in the air. I didn't need to look back. I had said enough. I had put everything on the table in front of everyone in the calmest voice I could maintain. What came next was no longer mine to carry. Outside the lobby, the night wind moved lightly. The parking lot had thinned out. I paused for a moment, adjusted my collar the way I always did before a difficult meeting. That familiar gesture reminded me that I was still in control of what needed controlling. Only one thing had slipped beyond my reach, and I knew exactly what it was. In my mind, the image of Isla from moments earlier appeared vividly. Not the radiant bride at the banquet table, but the child who used to sit on the warehouse steps, waiting for me to finish my night shift. I remembered how she held a glass of water, with both hands afraid of spilling it. I remembered the mornings I drove her to school, the smell of engine oil still clinging to my clothes. Those memories didn't vanish just because today I chose to stand up. I won in the way a businessman wins. The evidence was thick enough. The arguments were airtight. Every move had a reason. The company remained solid. The signing authority stayed in my hands. The documents prepared to strip me of my autonomy lost their power the moment light was shone directly on them. Rationally, this was the outcome that had to be. But fatherhood has no victory markers. I walked to my car, opened the door, sat behind the wheel. Inside it was quiet. No one called. The things that once forced me to change plans now lay still, as if they had never existed. I started the engine and drove away, leaving behind an evening that should have been the happiest day of my daughter's life. The drive home felt longer than usual, not because the distance had changed, but because my mind slowed down. I thought about the choices that had led me here. There are decisions that, if not made, bring even heavier consequences. I understood that clearly. I also understood that from today on, the father-daughter relationship as it once was could never return intact. My house was lit when I arrived. This house had once been where Marion waited for me every night. It had been where Isla grew up step by step. I hung up my coat, set my keys on the table. Everything was still in its old place, only the feeling inside was different. I sat down, leaned my back against the wooden chair, and breathed slowly. Many people might call what I did cruel. Some might say I chose the company over my daughter. I don't argue. I only know that if I had stayed silent, if I had yielded, I would have been pushed out of my own life, turned into a pretext for others to seize what I had built. Then I wouldn't have just lost the company. I would have lost the right to decide for myself. I don't want to live the rest of my life according to someone else's arrangements, even if that person shares my last name. That night, I opened the safe and checked the documents again. Everything was signed in the right place at the right time. Not because I doubted, but because that is the habit of someone who does not hand their fate over to chance. I closed the safe, turned off the lights, and went to the bedroom. The room was quiet enough for me to hear my own breathing clearly. I lay there without falling asleep right away. In my mind, the only remaining question had nothing to do with law or finance. It was much simpler from tomorrow. On how would I live with the void that had just formed, I didn't have an answer yet. Maybe it would take time. Maybe it would require accepting that some prices must be paid, even when you do the right thing. But at least I knew I was still standing. I was still the one deciding my own steps in business and in life. The next morning I woke up early, made a cup of coffee, watched the light come through the window like any other day. The city began to move. So did my company. Shipments would continue. Contracts would be fulfilled on schedule. Life's rhythm would go on. And I would learn to live with the truth that sometimes protecting yourself also means losing a very large part of your heart. I did not take revenge on my daughter. I simply refused to let her destroy me. I tell this story not to justify myself, nor do I expect anyone to take my side or my daughter's. I only want to say one thing clearly. There are moments in life when if you do not stand up, you will never have the chance to stand again. I lost my daughter in some way, but I kept my autonomy, kept the work of a lifetime I built, and most importantly, I did not lose myself. If you are in a situation where you must choose between outward peace and inner truth, I have no advice. I only know that the price of silence is sometimes far more expensive than the cost of speaking out. If you understand how I feel, leave a single dot below. I will know that I am not the only one who has ever stood before that choice. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that are imperfect, uncomfortable but real, follow along so we may meet again.